Hi, my name is Winston Linquister, and I'm a current undergraduate at Duke University. So, to those who may be wondering, the purpose of this podcast is to both fight stigma surrounding mental disability, as well as give a face or voice to those involved in disability studies, a field of study that is quite often unnoticed or unknown to many. Now, mind you, I don't have any real experience with video or audio editing, and this entire podcast is basically amateur. However, I hope either way, these conversations can give to our audience a better understanding of disability studies and those involved in it. So, thanks. I hope you enjoy and have a great Disability Pride Week.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of the Mad Studies podcast for Disability Pride Week. I'm your host, Winston Linquister, and today our guest is Dr. Mark Castrodale, a critical disability studies researcher, writer, and instructor at Brock University. Mark has published multiple papers surrounding disability studies and is active in disability advocacy. So, let's get started. How's it going today, Mark?
It's going really well. How are you?
Pretty good, pretty good. It's been a long day, but we're getting through it.
It's
So,
a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me, Winston. This is a great initiative.
no problem, no problem. So, for the viewers who may not be familiar with your work, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
So I identify as a critical disability studies scholar. I draw on MAD studies. I also draw on geographies of disability. And so I was drawn to this work for both personal and professional reasons. And I can comment more on the fields if you like, if you think that would be beneficial to readers, or I can also talk about what drew me into the fields.
Definitely. So, let's actually just start with what drew you into the fields. What got you involved in disability studies and advocacy?
So, at an early age, I was drawn into disability studies. Before I think I even knew what the field was, my mom was a special education teacher, and she worked in the Hamilton School Board. She advocated for the full inclusion of students with disabilities, but I think her real intention was to have transformative inclusion, to have people learn from each other, and not for a student with a disability to be sort of off to the side or marginalized or doing something different, but to really transform pedagogy in the classroom, and to rethink what education means and how education systems operate. So that my mom's work really influenced or informed why I wanted to do it. I've written on this in the past, but she passed away when I was at the age of 15 from breast cancer. So in many ways, I see this as a continuation. My work is a continuation of what her life's work was. Um, Secondly, one of my closest friends growing up is blind, and we went to university together, and it was the first time that he experienced barriers. Because of his blindness, he had professors say, "I don't think this course is actually for you. There's a lot of images and graphs." And this was outright exclusion. And since then, he's gone on to complete his PhD, and he's a professor at the University of in computer science. Um, but his undergraduate degree, in many ways, he had to advocate and fight for accommodations, which was an unnecessary burden that other students didn't encounter. So those influences drew me to disability studies. I had a professor say, "Why don't you research the experiences of blind and visually impaired students?" And he was Dr. Robert Wilton at McMaster University. And so I did, and I became more and more interested in the field.
Nice, nice. So, um, exactly how long have you been involved in the Mad Studies movement, or just scholarship within the Mad Studies movement?
So MAD studies, as it's named, would be, for me, it's relatively new that I would identify that I'm working within the field of MAD studies. I think critical disability studies and MAD studies share a lot of sort of commonalities, but also there's some differences. So in terms of doing MAD studies work, during my PhD dissertation, students actually introduced me to MAD studies. And at the same time, there was a book that came out called Mad Matters, which was very, very impactful. So before that, I think I was drawing on critical disability studies and thinking about um, psychiatric disabilities and how persons with invisible disabilities would be excluded on the basis of saneism. But what really sort of consolidated the field for me was reading Mad Matters. Another book was Mad at School by Dr. Margaret Price. And mad students who self identified and came forward to actually talk about how the university was alienating and oppressing them and not allowing them to actually enter classrooms and talk differently about mental health. So that's my forum into my early foray into mad studies has probably been, I want to say, 2 years, but I've been doing critical disability studies for close to a decade now.
Could you expand a little bit about those students that came forward to you about, or Matt students that came forward to you about different ways of exclusion through universities? Could you just tell us about that experience or some of their experiences that you'd like to highlight?
Well, yeah. So some of the students were talking about the university and they're saying, actually, this university represents a pretty hostile environment for students with disabilities. And students with mental health issues were along the same lines saying it's a pretty alienating environment. Mental health is represented as a individual pathologized illness, but we're not really talking about how the university as a space itself produces an environment that might not be open or welcoming or inclusive or easy to navigate. The types of pedagogy that instructors are using uh, in and of themselves could alienate particular individuals. The language around mental health is stigmatizing, and the MAD students were coming forward and actually talking about the ways that the psi sciences and psi violence is actually what was an issue. So they're talking about mental health systems, biomedical discourses around mental health. They're talking about the fact that they're not talking about systemic issues, poverty, lack of affordable housing, rape, abuse, neglect, um, racism, sexism. These issues are not being addressed when you talk about, an individual seeking treatment or pharmacological approaches to mental health. They really wanted the university to transform.
Nice. So, in your opinion, how would you say is the best way for a university to try and transform to really be more inclusive or actually bridge that gap to mad students?
I think a good place to start would be much like the disability movement, which says nothing about us without us. The MAD studies movement also says at the core, underpinning all the types of ways that we talk about mental health, we should draw on people with lived experience. So people who might identify as consumers, survivors, ex-patients, mad persons. They also will use language such as crazy persons, but the language around mental health and the policies and practices need to be informed by persons with lived experiences with mental health systems and people that are actually working uh, with that knowledge of experience. So it's from experience that I think universities should draw on their knowledges. It's not just students; it's also faculty members and staff. So mental health is it's an issue that is now gaining more and more and more momentum. But uh, I also think the language of crisis in university settings needs to be unpacked, and drawing on mad person's perspectives would be a great place to start.
Definitely, definitely. Now, you said lived experiences. In
Mhm.
one of your earlier emails to me, you actually mentioned you may have some of your own lived experiences. Would you mind sharing some of those?
Yeah, so I don't often talk about this publicly for a number of reasons, but I would like to share. So after my mom died of breast cancer, I was about 15 years of age. my first encounter with sort of a mental health worker, guidance counselor, was in the high school system. And he very openly and caringly said, though, like, are you having any thoughts of suicide? And I mean, well, I was taken back. I said, well, no. But it was almost like like planting a seed. It was like, well, is there something wrong with me for not thinking right now? I mean, is that what people think about when they lose their mother? Like, um, and so I buried my head in books after high school. I read a lot. I did things, played drums by myself. I interacted with other people, but a lot of it was trying to pass as happy, putting on a face and a smile. And then during my undergraduate degree, I was not really interested in much. So I didn't know what to do. I was experiencing depression. I've written about it with my friend and Dr. Daniel Zingaro. We wrote a paper about friendship as a method, where I talk a little bit about my experiences with depression in higher education. But it really was something that was very private and something that I didn't disclose, not to professors, not to instructors. It's still something that I don't often talk about in academic circles because faculty members who might be perceived as having mental health issues are alienated from hiring processes, might face greater surveillance or scrutiny. So there's a number of sort of, I think, reasons why I'm not very open about my past lived experiences with depression. But having been exposed to MAD studies was really a pivotal moment in my life. A professor, Jeffrey Reum at York University in critical disability studies, developed a course called MAD People's History. And I was able to take this course where you actually look at the histories of people who have been in asylums, but it's not from, the medical practitioners or staff. It's from the perspective of patients who have undergone treatments, who have undergone confinement and forced labor, who are sort of pushing back in interesting, nuanced ways, creating their own art, inscribing their names on the bricks of CAMH in Toronto. So that to me was something, because I said, well, all right, it's really important that these people have their voices heard and their knowledge is represented. And so for me, that has been positive and a way for me to make sense of my life and hopefully do some good in the academy. Another thing I don't often disclose is I was prescribed antidepressants, which I'm still making sense of that, because I do believe that it may have impacted my memory abilities in the long term. So there might have been some positive gains, but I might, in the course of my life, experience long-term pains as a result of the pharmacological intervention.
All right. Well, thank you so much
Yeah.
for expanding on those experiences.
Yeah.
So first and foremost, some of our audience may have similar experiences with depression. So,
Yeah.
from your perspective, how would you recommend, or how would you advise them in maybe overcoming that degree of adversity or coming to terms with it?
I think it's incredibly difficult and it's unique. Depression is something that sort of floats around like a word that many people know. I'm depressed today. I don't feel great. I feel, you know, it's thrown around often. I think for me, depression is a way that I've made sense of the world. I tend to refute the fact that it was a chemical imbalance in my brain. I don't know if science has necessarily proven that fact, and there's sort of counter science now that's saying, yeah, that serotonin reuptake inhibitors may have brain damaging effects that actually don't help in the long run. I don't admonish any approach. So if people are doing things, they have to make choices for themselves. But I think for me, mental health is political, and that's the point that I would get across. That it's difficult to advocate and self-advocate, but people aren't alone. And the MAD studies movement and MAD pride in the MAD community are pushing back against systemic oppression in many ways. Um, if we think about diagnostic labeling practices such as drapetomania, which was a black slave who wanted to run away from their slave owner, were sort of thought of as having a mental health condition called drapetomania, or hysteria in women, or even gay people were apologized, and homosexuality was seen as deviant, according to the American Psychological Association, the DSM. I think it was the second DSM. So these labels carry with them deep meanings that have shifted and changed over time. But what are we doing when we're understanding ourselves through these labels? And if we're individualizing grief, as was the case that I experienced, well, it's okay to stop. And I think at that point in my life, maybe someone should have said, you don't have to. You don't have to. I think McRuer, a disability studies scholar, would call it compulsory able-bodiedness. You don't have to engage in this able-bodied act. It's too much at times, and to carry on without pausing. For me was I think what really was hard on me in life. So I can't really speak to other people's experiences of depression, but there's peer support out there, and so there's different avenues for help. And if people are experiencing distress, I think connecting with people in the local community and having different avenues of support is key.
Thank you so much. Now, before I forget about this, earlier you did talk about faculty exclusion within your own experience. Do you mind expanding or elaborating on that, and maybe how that relates to MAD studies in higher education, or are those completely unrelated?
Well, no, MAD studies, I think MAD studies and critical disability studies share some commonalities and some overlaps. Certainly, I mean, members within both community might sort of sometimes be within both communities, but also people might not want to identify with psychiatric disabilities. They might instead use the language neurodivergent or MAD. So there are political differences with how people might locate themselves, but I tend to draw on both fields because I think for me it situates me well. Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Sorry.
It was about faculty, I think. So faculty alienation or faculty?
Faculty exclusion. Yeah. You mentioned earlier that you were worried about, with your diagnosis of depression, you were worried about potential faculty exclusion or opportunities for you. Do you mind expanding on that?
Yeah, I don't think disclosing depression will necessarily be advantageous to me as a potential hire or a candidate. I worry about the stigma around the notion that people have to perpetually write and perform and fit within this neoliberal university structure. And I think that not everyone operates or fits in the same way. So as an example, if I am experiencing depression, I may not function or write or socialize in the same ways when I'm not really experiencing depression. And so it's almost like in terms of productivity, I'm playing a catch-up game to maintain a certain level of productivity that's expected of a faculty member. I have to make up for that lost time by writing and reading and trying to find some balance in life. But that's what concerns me in terms of talking about mental health and being in the academy. And I think so. Um, Jay Dolmage at the University of Dr. Jay Dolmage at the University of Waterloo says, to think about the university, you're not just able-bodied as a faculty. You sort of have to be hyper able. You have to be at this top level of productivity, working, socializing, and doing all these tasks, not just well, exceptionally well. And I think that's a lot of pressure to put on various faculty members who might write and work and think at different paces. And so I hope the fields of mad studies and critical disability studies can push back against the neoliberal pace of the universities. I'm reading a book called The Slow Professor Movement. I think it's called The Slow Professor. And so to think about the pace at which we're all sort of compelled to write and publish articles, I think there might be a need to slow down and produce quality over quantity. But I'm still wrapping my mind around what it means to be to come and say that I've experienced depression in the academy. But I don't link it directly to myself as an individual in that sense. I actually want to unpack the ways that I think the higher education produces a level of stress, a level of anxiety, and I think locating in the social spatial environment rather than in the individual, for me, is a meaningful way to make sense of university policies and practices and what's actually happening in our contemporary universities today.
Definitely. Now, from your experience with depression, there's a bit of a debate right now as to how to consider any sort of mental disability as in terms of somebody's identity and as something to treat rather than cure, or as just say a disability and something to try to get rid of essentially. How do you feel about that and that idea of mental or say madness as either identity or disability?
Yeah, so I think the disability comes at the way society understands mental, and I'll use bunny ears, but mental illness. So when someone understands themselves through this, through various labels, they're disabled by virtue of not having access to meaningful employment, by being denied access to healthcare, by not having the same access to education. This is what's disabling. So I think that's what I would call the that's what saneism is to me. It's the exclusion and marginalization of people with mental health mental health labels or mental or experiences with mental health systems.
Definitely.
Yeah, it's difficult to say because I don't want to say in a prescriptive way what people should do when they're navigating the system. Rather than, for me, it's more important for me to critique or examine various systems. And for me, it's been the academy. So what I did find out was that students who identified as MAD within my study were going into their instructors' classes, and some were going into psychology classes, and they were saying, well, actually, you're not talking about my experience. This isn't my narrative of mental health. Through all these different kind of labeling practices and forms of treatment, you're not actually, you're not talking about my experience. So their experiences weren't reflected in the curriculum, the course curriculum at that level. And so they wanted to interject their own voices, knowledges, and perspectives to inform different types of course curriculum, readings, practices. And I think that could be very transformative. So if people are maybe experiencing distress rather than seeking a clinical or biomedical type of approach, one, I'm interested in what the actual social spatial environment is that it is producing, perhaps in some way, discursively or otherwise, at the level of embodiment, producing some effects on individuals on how they can understand themselves. But also, I want to know, how are people connecting others in the university, and how might peer support be a different avenue for understanding anything around like distress or crisis, different responses.
Definitely. Wow. So, you oftentimes bring up the whole Medicare system in context with mental health. What are your critiques of the modern Medicare system? I know you live in Canada, so it might be a bit different for how it's treated in the United States, but just the general system of general system of healthcare, or its reliance on using medication in order to treat uh, mental differences.
Um, so now there's been various scholars who have written on this, and I'll point you to some different perspectives around critiques of big pharma. That so that's a whole massive area. I think where MAD studies is really making ground. Um, in terms of the medical system, I'll talk about my understanding from a Canadian context. So, having a public system, people generally have access to medications. It's seen as a universal right. Access to healthcare is seen as a universal right. That being said, we still have people who might deal with incarceration on medical grounds where they are forcefully confined. And persons with mental health issues also face systemic violence. So they might experience higher homelessness. They might, so they don't. It's not a level playing field. The healthcare system and access to it is not level. We purport to have sort of universal care and access. I think MAD studies is critique the institutionalization, historic approaches that have happened around how MAD people have been treated. So I can't really comment too much on Medicaid, other than I think I would like to see a society where people with mental health issues aren't treated with a biomedical, pathological kind of pathologizing response. Sometimes behavior that's conformist or deviant is just that. It's not a medical issue.
It's just difference.
Yeah. Yeah, and people say, there's neurodivergent is another language that's being used, and so it's not a health issue. I mean, I come back to it. Mental health is political.
Definitely. So is that the perspective that you approach MAD studies with, that political idea instead of necessarily a health idea?
Uh, it's a bit of both. So for me, I draw heavily on a social model of disability, and I apply a social understanding to the determinants of mental health. So for me, I want to look at the lived environment. I want to look at how spaces are constructed in ways that might be alienating. One thing that I do in one of my courses, I talk about hostile architecture, where, for homeless people, you'll see spikes and other types of things, where park benches that are purposefully architecturally designed to keep people out of place, to deny access to that part of the built environment. So it's a type of cruelty and violence that people experience in the world, and that to me is something that I'm curious about. I want to link to issues around mental health, how spatiality impacts persons' well-being and mental health.
So, when you teach classes that are involved with critical disability studies or MAD studies, um, do you try to teach them in an angle of advocacy or research or history, or how do you try to kind of push your students to get involved, or is it all of the above?
So it is a bit of, so you noted history and advocacy. I draw on geographies of disability. I draw on disability studies theorists. I try to interject different critical readings. And so one assignment that my students are currently working on is I want them to do a sort of case study approach involving fieldwork of our university site to identify structures that might be ableist or exclusionary. To look at, I think one of the first things people notice is the built environment, so stairs instead of ramps, those types of a lack of braille. They're in the physical environment and they show who is meant to be in a place and who's imagined not to ever enter that site. So I think my students, when they critique the university, they start looking at these structures in the built environment, and they see the ways that people are with mobility issues are excluded. So that's an early entry point.
Definitely. Kind of funny. For the Disability Pride Week
Yeah.
celebration over here at Duke, there's a pledge where for a day you basically kind of mentally think of yourself as you're in a wheelchair. So you're not allowed to go up any hard angles such as curbs. You have to use ramps for everything. And the idea of it is to really just make students think about what it means to live in like an ableist campus versus one that's actually accommodating for people with physical impairments. So it's really interesting that your class like focuses on that idea. So kind of
I'm really happy they're doing that at Duke. I think it's really incredible to start thinking of how ableist and exclusionary university sites can actually be. I don't think it's purposeful, but I think universities were predominantly designed for people who are very white and able-bodied, and this has been sort of the legacy of universities. So they've been gatekeeping institutions, but welcoming in all these different perspectives and having an inclusionary campus really, really enhances the fabric of a university.
definitely, I agree. So, kind of going back to MAD studies and critical disability studies, for you, how does it feel to be pioneering a relatively untapped, relatively new field of study? I believe MAD studies wasn't even technically minted till 1990 or as early as 1991. So,
So, so mad people have existed. Mad people and the mad and pushing back against the ways that mad people have been violently treated in society. I don't think that's new. I mean, you can go back to medieval times. Um, I think what becomes interesting for me uh, is where mad studies is going. Um, I think it's a place that seeks out equity and social justice. It is driven in ways to think intersectionally around racism and sexism, ableism, classism. Uh, it values the knowledges of people with lived experiences in ways that I think are needed. We design mental health policies and persons who have experiences like survivors, consumers, ex-patients perspectives haven't been involved. So for me, it makes sense as a field, but and I do think the approach that I'm trying to advocate is I want to work specifically in education. I would do a lot of work with teacher candidates. So for me, I say I want teachers to get mad. I want, at the fundamental level, teachers and educational systems, and I mean get mad, not only get angry with the systemic injustices that we're experiencing today and in these political times, but I want teachers to get mad, to have an understanding that when they are working with children, when they are understanding and pathologizing a child who's maybe not responding well to curriculum that the child might not be interested in, or they might be acting in ways that are deemed behavioral or nonconformist, they're often the first point of these early interventions into the pathologization of children. So I want teachers and teacher candidates to really understand MAD studies. And so my push is to sort of understand what pedagogies are MAD studies scholars using, how are they developing them, and what goes into MAD curriculum. That's one of the interests. But in terms of being a pioneer, I want to speak to that, because there's people who are really important in the MAD field who influenced me and opened up my perspective to MAD studies. So I mentioned Jeffrey Reum at York University. His work developing MAD people's history and all his writing was an early point for me. Dr. Catherine Church at Ryerson University is also someone whose scholarship has been really, really influential. Dr. Jennifer Poole, Dr. Brenda Lefrancois, Peter Beresford. These are scholars who are really pushing the field. They're pioneers. I also think, Dr. Bonnie Burstow's work that's located in anti-psychiatry is becoming very, very important and influential to pay attention to. My supervisor, Dr. Wayne Martino, he wouldn't identify. He wasn't situated in the field, but he really allowed me and provided me with support and critical readings, drawing on Foucault and Nicholas Rose to think about the subjugated knowledges of MAD persons. I'm also inspired by the work of MAD students. I'm inspired by the scholarship as well of Lucy Costa, Zhejian Veronka, and Yasna Rousseau. So I draw on their work in much of my work. And I have some resources, but maybe I'll share that later for people who might want to connect or read more.
I was about to say to the audience, in case you were hoping to look into some of these scholars, I'll definitely try to link them in the description of this video, just to make sure that we all have an understanding and all are able to really have access to these different mindsets and different ideologies,
That
or
would
not
be
necessarily
fantastic.
ideologies, but scholars.
One strategy that's MAD students taught me, and it's one that I do at every institution where I find myself now, is to look at the university library and see if there's MAD studies books available to students. And if I can, I try to advocate or work with the university to try to have some of these texts available for students so that they can actually access and read and gain insights into these knowledges. So it's a good strategy. I think it's one strategy of many, but it's a good way to get the knowledges on campus.
Definitely. So, how would you say the reception of MAD studies has been in general higher education? In my experience, I just simply wasn't really aware of it until relatively recently. In your experience as a scholar within MAD studies, how would you say the reception has been for either institutions or other scholars that aren't, say, involved in your field?
Uh, so there's mixed reactions. When I say MAD studies, usually the first question I get is, so what's that? And then I have to sort of go through, well, it's reclaiming the term MAD from its pejorative roots, much like queer studies scholars reclaim the term queer. It's a political stance. It is draws on history. So I have to go through it examines sanus depression. I have to go through all of that. So is the field making headway? Yeah, it's gaining a lot of attention. I think in Canadian context, I've seen students really want to learn about MAD studies, and people are open and kind of saying, well, what is that? But uh, as much as I want to say that's happening, there's also within various disciplinary knowledge sets um, a desire to sort of push back against MAD studies, to keep it out, because maybe it's seen as um, questioning psi disciplinary knowledges. it questions biomedical knowledges. It's questioning these disciplinary fields, and it's asking difficult questions about the nature of research in the academy, about ethics, about a whole bunch of things. Um, so, as much as it's gaining in sort of gaining interest in mad studies, there's still a lot of pushback.
Thank you for that insight.
There was a recent article in University Affairs, which I can give you a link to as well, which talks about the rise. I think the title is called "The Rise of Mad Studies." But I think Dr. Beresford also wrote, an article about the field of mad studies and protecting it from co-option. So thinking about how the knowledge and the way that mad studies is operationalizing in the university might actually, we need to fend off this type of neoliberal co-option of the field.
I
So
agree.
both really interesting articles to read.
Definitely. We'll have those links within the descriptions just so that our audience will again get to experience them.
Yeah.
So, kind of again, drawing to our audience, for students who were previously unaware of MAD studies or the larger disability pride movement who may be interested in getting involved in the field, where would you say is a good place for them to start outside of reading articles and books?
Okay. Well, outside there's a fantastic WordPress site. So I would say Mad Studies. I think the link is madstudies2014.wordpress.com, and a great introduction would be Lucy Costa. She wrote a fantastic piece called "Mad Studies: What is it and why you should care." Mad Studies, why is it and what is it and why you should care. And so that would be a great place. I think, reading up about the Mad Pride movement would be another great place. I do like some books. So there's one, Mad at School by Dr. Margaret Price, that is, for me, has been really influential. And Mad Matters, a critical reader in Canadian Mad Studies, edited by Brenda Lefrancois, Robert Menzies, and Jeffrey Reum. And that one, for me, was also very, very influential. I think those would be great places for students to get an early introduction to Mad Studies.
All right, definitely. And do you know of any universities in particular that have a good, say, starting point for looking, like in terms of an institutional or academic setting, really getting into MAD studies or critical disability studies?
In Canadian contexts, so if you're looking into disability studies or critical disability studies, I know the University of Syracuse website has a list, and they keep it fairly current of all the disability studies programs. So there are programs throughout the United States, throughout the world. I draw a lot on scholars in Canada, in the US, in Britain, as well as Australia. For Mad Studies, for me, Ryerson University has been a catalyst site. It's been incredibly active with scholarship, with Catherine Church there, Jeffrey Reum, Marcia Ryu at York University. That's a critical disability studies program in Canada that's been incredibly active for Canadian scholarship. And disability studies program at King's University of Western Ontario is a relatively newer program, but it's been expanding and growing as well. And so there's different pockets that are very active in Canadian contexts. I'd like to see more offerings at different universities. Students are actually asking for it, and coming together and petitioning for courses at Ontario universities around disability studies and MAD studies. So it would be great to see more growth in that field. There's definitely a demand for different perspectives.
Wow, so I hope that gives our audience something to think about in terms of trying to get involved in this movement. So it looks like we're getting close to running out of time here.
Okay.
So just as like a last statement, are there any final messages you'd like to give to our listeners slash viewers? Like any points you'd like to get across, not only about MAD studies, but your experience with depression and say overcoming that form of adversity and being more involved in advocacy for those with mental health issues?
Yeah. For me, activism is linked to my teaching. It's linked to how I live my life, everything that I do. So I do view my teaching as being very political and questioning the knowledges that are being circulated in classrooms, the ways images of mental health are being portrayed, or the studies and research that's happening at my university site or the institution, the ethics around research. These are levels of engagement that I think students can and should take up. For me, I don't link up to discourses around resilience. I don't consider myself particularly a resilient individual. The people who carried me through difficult times were my friends and family, and making those connections and friendships were things that carried me through what were difficult times in my life. But MAD studies also, and the MAD movement, MAD Pride also celebrates difference around how we experience our lives as mental beings. So for me, my experience is not cannot be universalized to other people's experiences around mental health, but the language of crisis can be refuted. Um, if there is a mental health crisis, we should question it and question the roots underpinning why so many people would be dealing with distress in the academy. What is it about the academy that produces this type of stressful or stress-inducing environment? Um, so there's a lot that can be done. Push back, think critically, and inject and interject different voices. Draw on the knowledges of disabled persons. If you're speaking about them or mad persons, consult at the very core, involve, participate. They need to be involved in every aspect of policy, practice, governance, in how we think about our universities. So that would be my take home.
All right. Thank you so much. All right, everybody. That was Dr. Mark Castrodale. Again, thank you so much for your insights. And to the audience, I will definitely have as many of those books and scholars that Mark mentioned linked down in the description. Hopefully, he'll help me out a little bit in compiling all of these, but I hope that we'll be able to spread this message of ad studies to a greater audience. So, again, thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you, Winston.